My name is Vincent Biondo, and I want to thank you all for being here on a beautiful sunny Friday. My paper is called September 11th, 2002, Memorial Culture, American Muslims, and Public Space. One of the major themes I've focused on for the last 3 years, researching Islam in Southern California, is how the contemporary American context potentially influences a 1,400-year-old global religion. Though some may argue that time and place have no influence upon religious belief, time and place do exercise an influence upon religious practice, which then goes on to influence social and political life. Recently, there has been a profound demographic change that challenges us to rethink what we mean by religion in America, a nation in which religion is intimately bound up with its history and basic values. Since the immigration reforms of 1965, almost 1 million Muslims have immigrated to the U.S. through Los Angeles, transforming Islam into one of the largest religions in America. Though representing only a 10 to 15% increase in the population of Muslims in America, these new immigrants arrived at a time when America was becoming more aware of its multicultural and religiously pluralistic nature. The assimilation, or, quote, melting pot model of American immigration began to recede into the background, to be replaced by a model of accommodation. These new immigrants were financially secure and well-educated doctors, engineers, and computer scientists. Hoping for more than economic survival and a better future for their children, the new immigrants also wanted to preserve and promote the cultural and religious heritages they brought with them, for their children's sake certainly, but also to influence culture and contribute to the American fabric. Southern California has emerged as the key center for the new immigration. During the last 10 years, the number of purpose-built mosques and schools constructed locally have risen tenfold. The efforts of the new immigrants have been instrumental in mobilizing the 7 to 10 million Muslims living in America. Their goals are simple: to be treated equally as American citizens and to participate more fully in American public life. I believe that this step of entering into the public sphere involves a process of negotiation which influences both American pluralism and American Islam. I also think it is fair to say that a, quote, new American Muslim identity is emerging out of this process. If the American Muslim community is transforming public culture, then what are the implications for religious pluralism in America? In the context of September 11th memorialization, 4 dramaturgical interfaith events provide a window into how American Islam is entering the public arena. Also, 2 kinds of interfaith efforts emerge that are competing in the public sphere: a Protestant version and a pluralistic version. My week of memorial interfaith events started off on September 8th at the Islamic Center of Southern California on Vermont Avenue west of downtown Los Angeles. The spiritual home for many post-1965 immigrants staged a media event designed to memorialize the victims of September 11th, demonstrate the Americanness of American Muslims, and thank civic and religious leaders for upholding the law and protecting diversity during the 12 months following the attacks. In the audience, approximately 300 people filled the meeting area and overflowed onto the street outside. In the presence of 2 television crews and 2 radio news teams, Dr. Hajer Benhadjsalem, a father of the American Muslim community, spoke openly of the intention to attract media coverage with this event and chastised the media for not, quote, showing the whole panorama of this country. The first of 3 sets of awards and acceptance speeches were given by leaders from 6 levels of local law enforcement. Each confirmed their solidarity with the American Muslim people and emphasized their goal to protect all Americans under the law. Next, 3 Muslim leaders took the opportunity to emphasize the Americanness of Muslim immigrants. Prominent among these was Dr. Abdel Ahmed, chairman of the mosque's board of directors, who stated, quote, "Our country was attacked by evil forces, and terrorism has no faith. We strongly condemn the acts of September 11th. Thirdly, interfaith and civil rights leaders were given awards for their efforts helping American Muslims to enter the mainstream of American culture. To conclude the event, 3 women presented a quilt they had sewn to be taken to Ground Zero. In each of the 99 squares, 20 names of victims of the attacks were sewn in alphabetical order by first name, There were whole squares of Dianes, Michaels, and Mohammeds. On September 9th, the Progressive Jewish Alliance and Muslim Public Affairs Council reinitiated their monthly interfaith dialogues in the basement of the Emmanuel Presbyterian Church on Wilshire Boulevard. All 50 participants were either Jewish or Muslim, despite the open invitation to the general public. 4 television news crews were also invited to attend. The organizers, Daniel Sokach and Dr. Nayer Ali, at the beginning and end of the meeting, spoke of the importance of tolerance and conversation. For the bulk of the event, Jews and Muslims split up to opposite sides of the room to drop a list of concerns. Both groups voiced a similar frustration with extremists in their own faith traditions and wondered what they could do to take action. Dr. Ali later told me that a sign of extremism might be a distinction between those willing or unwilling to participate in dialogue. On September 11, 2002, the new Catholic Cathedral in downtown LA hosted the largest event of the week. Billed as the official civic memorial for Los Angeles, streets were closed down and police motorcycles led a procession up West Temple Street under a fire truck ladder arch from which descended a giant American flag. Inside, 100 religious leaders from every world religion filled rows of seats upon the sanctuary and 2 side transepts. Hollywood actor Angelica Houston opened the event with the statement, quote, "We are all one under God," a theme to be repeated throughout the event. Instead of religious songs, the choir sang "America the Beautiful" and "God Bless America," which, given the smell of fresh paint, cool air conditioning, large open space, imported marble, and booming acoustics, sounded quite impressive. The spirit of the event was captured by Rabbi Mark Diamond, who said, quote, "If we cannot see God in all, then we cannot see God at all." On the evening of September 11th, the 4th and final event I attended was a sunset interfaith service in the Crown Valley Community Park in Laguna, Niguel, a wealthy Christian community in southern Orange County. Organized by Kay Lindahl and the Alliance for Spiritual Community, with support from the City Council, at least 100 families attended with lawn chairs and picnic baskets. The audience straggled in during the performance of a Native American woman named Kathy Sandoval, who burned sage and danced in 6 directions. Next, Frank Hotchkiss read the second and last paragraphs from the Declaration of Independence before Mayor Joe Brown spent almost an hour giving community appreciation awards to local police and fire personnel to thank them for their service. This took up most of the time, making an interfaith event seem like a police appreciation event. The audience gave the police officer standing ovations before singing John Lennon's Imagine to conclude the event. What do these 4 memorialization dramas tell us about public culture? First, America has become a memorial culture, as tragedies like the Oklahoma City bombing, Columbine High School massacre, 2 space shuttle disasters, and September 11th attacks have served to unite the American people much more than the Vietnam War or Civil Rights Movement did. Not only does memorialization unite Americans across religion, class, gender, race, and ethnic lines, but memorialization has also become a key vehicle by which minority groups can make claims on public space. In the words of Ed Linenthal, quote, "Much more than a gesture of remembrance, memorialization is a way to stake one's claim to visible presence in the culture." Memorials serve to unite Americans, and they involve negotiated competitions for public space. Though public sphere is a more popular term, I will use public space because what is involved is something concrete and territorial that is free for any part of the public to occupy. As with the public sphere, public space is also defined as distinct from the official and private spheres, and is where the general public speaks and acts, free from the authority of political, religious, or legal institutions. Southern California's interfaith memorial commemorations of September 11th have larger implications for American pluralism as we enter the 21st century. 2 different approaches to interfaith memorials reveal competing responses to pluralism. Though all 4 events reflected a tolerant spirit, a distinction emerged between pluralistic accommodationists and Protestant assimilationists, each based on contested ideas of America's religious heritage and future identity. In the first 3 events, a religious minority community emphasized a pluralism that reflects an interpretation of American history and civil religion based upon constitutional law. For minority populations and dissenters, the Constitution and Bill of Rights are the legal foundations of public space. The Laguna Niguel event, on the other hand, was organized by the dominant religious community and offered a combination of civic engagement and religious faith that will tolerate rather than accommodate minority communities. While the Muslim and Jewish events emphasized principles of equality, dialogue, and human rights, the Protestant event invoked civil religion's tolerance for others whom agree to love both God and country. These two visions for the future of religious pluralism demand a reevaluation of Bella's 1967 notion of civil religion. Adapting Rousseau's concept to American religious history, Bella's thesis rests upon a civil religion versus theological religion or public versus private distinction. In the language of Rousseau, quote, "Civil religion joins divine worship to a love of the law, in that in making the homeland the object of the citizens' adoration, it teaches them that the service of the state is the service of the tutelary God. Then, to die for one's country is to become a martyr, to break the law to be impious, and to subject a guilty man to public execration is to hand him over to the wrath of God." End of quote. This viewpoint anticipates the dominant conservative Protestant interpretation of American civil religion. There is an alternative vision, however, based upon the right to dissent against earthly unjust laws in the name of a higher law. Thus, many Americans revolted against the Crown, against slavery, against segregation, and against an anti-communist witch hunt using an alternative religious voice. According to The Restructuring of American Religion by Robert Wuthnow, this is the competing minority liberal Protestant version of American civil religion. There is a tension in American religious history between individual religion in private and civil religion in public that is open to contestation and negotiation in public space. In fact, a strong public-private distinction, often referred to as the separation of church and state, makes religion into a powerful vehicle for social and political change because any American citizen can speak in the name of their private religion or, quote, higher authority. According to Wuthnow's thesis, Protestant denominationalism was replaced by a liberal Protestant versus conservative evangelical Protestant tension after World War II, which in the 1980s emerged along Democrat and Republican lines. Wuthnow suggests that Jesse Jackson and Jerry Falwell might represent two poles in American Protestantism. As a result, there now exist, quote, two civil religions with a common ancestry but opposing destinies. But Bella's and Wuthnow's descriptions of two civil religions competing in public space leave little room for non-Protestant groups. In the present day, tensions between Christians and Muslims, or religious pluralists and tolerant Protestants, may be as important as a liberal versus conservative Protestant distinction in determining the future of pluralism in the U.S. In Southern California, 4 September 11th memorial events reveal two responses to pluralism which demand a reinterpretation of Bella's notion of American civil religion. Rather than two Protestant interpretations of American history competing in the field of public space, we now also find Catholics, Jews, and most recently Muslims forming a truly pluralistic nation. The American Muslim community may be especially important because as they make claims upon public space, they are also in the process of negotiating within themselves whether to tip the balance towards one side or the other. Interfaith activities are clearly powerful sites for negotiating claims upon public space. At the Islamic Center of Southern California event, Dr. Hathout was proclaiming, "We are Americans, we are citizens, we condemn terrorism, and we are important possessors of public space to be respected by government officials and other religious communities." At the Emmanuel Presbyterian Church, the Jewish Progressive Alliance was arguing that Zionists and Orthodox Jews must not hijack Judaism and that liberal Jews must speak out to more strongly assert themselves in public space. At the Catholic Cathedral, the LA Archdiocese first realized their goal of making the cathedral the physical center of civil religious public space in Los Angeles. In Laguna Niguel, a tolerant Protestant interfaith organization, got official backing from the city to represent the community as one supportive of the dominant civil religion based on love of God and country. All 4 September 11th interfaith events demonstrate that memorial culture can be an effective avenue by which religious groups can participate in the dominant culture, and in doing so, make claims upon public space which intend to challenge the future of religious pluralism in America. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you so much, Vince. You paved the way for my talk. In this paper, I will try to study Muslim public activism and how it was influenced by certain factors, including the changing in the pattern of immigration, mainly after 1965, with the changing social and economic background and intellectual background of immigrants, and how also it was influenced by political and ideological developments affecting American perception of the Muslim world, and mainly these developments took place in the Middle East, and because of the US involvement in these developments in a direct or an indirect way, these had an influence on domestic politics in the United States. The literature on immigrant Muslim communities in general from the turn of the 19th century till the 1990s shows that their involvement in American politics went through a number of stages, and these stages were affected to a large extent by the factors that I have already mentioned. These stages certainly reflect identity crises through which the Muslim communities went in rationalizing their choices as Muslims by choice in a predominantly Christian culture where the principles, norms, and laws of their religions cannot totally be applied in the United States. The paper is an attempt also to study the impact of 9/11 on public activism for American Muslim civil liberties by presenting 9/11 as a catalyst that gave a sudden lurch to a grassroots movement that emerged in the mid-1990s and became full-fledged in the mid-1980s and became full-fledged in the 1990s. It will also be an attempt to trace patterns of continuity and change in the strategies adopted by these organizations and the extent to which they can present a national pattern for Muslim groups in the United States, some of which had always tried to put at bay the gospel of politics in the name of preaching the word of God or in the name of ad-dawah. I will try first to sketch the developments in Muslim public activism, early attempts at political organization. The first immigrants who came from the Muslim world to the United States were not interested in institution building. The most obvious and the most important, maybe one of the first most important organizations was the Federation of Islamic Associations that was created after the Second World War and by General Abdullah Agram. The aim of the Federation was to seek recognition for Islam as one of the civil religions in the United States in general and in the U.S. Army in particular. The Federation of Islamic Associations did not, for example, try to emphasize the Arab consciousness or the Arab political consciousness or an Islamic consciousness. This shift came in 1963 with the emergence of the Muslim Student Association on American campuses. The emergence of the Muslim Student Association reflected a shift in the identity in the Arab world, which was reaction to the developments also in the Middle East, and mainly the defeat of the Arabs in the Arab-Israeli war after 1967. There was a shift in the Arab world from emphasis on the Arab nationalism, the Arab identity, and the belief in Nasserism, to the emphasis on the Islamic identity and the birth of the Islamicist movements after the defeat. So this was reflected on the American campuses in the 1960s. You find on the one hand the disciples of the Federation of the Islamic Associations, or the Arab Americans, whose parents came as early immigrants and they represent the second generation, and who are perceived by the newly coming students from the Islamic world as being Americanized. They do not, according to them, they did not practice the true Islam. So these students of the Muslims in the Muslim Student Association presented themselves as the safeguarders of Islam, and they represent the true religion. Their message was received with much appeal among American Muslims, and their chapters developed throughout U.S. campuses, and this led to the emergence of the Islamic Society of North America, which is an umbrella organization under which the Muslim Student Association became subsumed. Yet the religious clout that was associated with ISNA did not detract from the political halo that surrounded the offshoots of the FIA during the post-1967 era. As the 1970s and 80s witnessed the growth of a network of Arab American organizations, including the National Association of Arab Americans, the Arab American Anti-Discrimination Committee, and the Association of Arab American Graduates, and the Arab American Institute. Needless to say that Israel in 1982 made a great service to the Arab American Anti-Discrimination Committee when it invaded Lebanon. According to Muhammad Nimr in the North American Muslim Resource Guide, ADC's work also has been influenced by current events. Although the plight of the Palestinians has been a strong focus of the group since the inception, the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982 marked a high point in ADC's mobilization efforts. The invasion was a turning point in American public opinion about the Arab-Israeli conflict. For the first time in history, Israel was seen on television screens as an invader. The role of the Israeli army in the massacre at Sabra and Shatila refugee camps damaged the position of the pro-Israeli lobby, which in the past had a de facto monopoly over America's Middle East policy. Since then, IDC's argument that Americans should become more sensitive to the other side of the conflict has had a better chance of being heard, unquote. The acclaim with which the Arab American organizations were met in the mid-1980s in the Muslim communities in the US in general, and the frustration at the US's almost uncritical support for Israel made many voices in ISNA to start calling for the establishment of a national Muslim public advocacy branch within the umbrella organization, because ISNA at the time was the greatest or the biggest Muslim organization in the United States. This political controversy added fuel to the already burning ethnic and ideological conflicts in the institution, reinforced to a large extent by the money flows coming from foreign Islamic countries. Such conflicts culminated in the secession of the primarily Indo-Pakistani group that formed ICNA. ISNA in the mid-1980s failed to address the diversity of views within the Muslim community, and it was left to strong local organizations such as the Islamic Center of Southern California and the Islamic Society of Greater Houston to offer alternatives to the sections of the within the Muslim community who were interested in tasting the political waters. The tide reversed towards more political involvement in the mid-1980s and 1990s, and this was enhanced mainly through the efforts of former Congressman Paul Findlay, with his unfailing support for the Muslim community. And in 1985, he published his book, They Dare Speak Out, which stirred Arab and American Muslim fears about the pervasiveness of pro-Israel pacts and their impact on American politics. Though Findlay repeatedly warned American Muslims in his addresses to their forums that they should not wait for a crisis to occur before offering factual information about their religion, events in the 1990s, including developments in the Middle East, such as the first war with Iraq, attacks against U.S. targets both at home, like the 1993 bombing of the World Trade Center, and abroad, such as the bombing of American embassies, whose perpetrators claimed responsibility for them in the name of Islam, and those acts in which the media and U.S. officials rushed to judgment and attributed to Islamic agents, such as the Oklahoma City bombing, were landmarks that brought into prominence the present most active network of national American Muslim public advocacy organizations. These include the American Muslim Council, AMC, founded in June 1990. It played an important role during the First Gulf War, rising to the height of the occasion in attempting to solve the problem of American Muslim military involvement in a war against their co-religionists. It brought the Pentagon to appoint the first Muslim chaplain. IMC's lobbying efforts were crowned when the Clinton administration appointed the first ever Muslim ambassador, Osman Siddiqui, in 1999, and when both chambers of Congress passed resolutions whereby they acknowledged Islam as an Abrahamic faith, along with Judaism and Christianity, and the contribution of American Muslims to society in 2000. The second major organization that emerged in the 1990s is the Muslim Public Affairs Council. It was established in 1992, and its main focus seemed to have been directed towards dispelling the image of the Muslim as a fanatic terrorist. One of its strategies was to show that terrorism is not endemic or is not unique to Islam. In a 1997 report on terrorism, MPAC presented an inventory of what it defined as terrorist attacks. These included the U.S. atomic bombing of Hiroshima I'm quoting, the U.S. atomic bombing of Hiroshima in World War II, the bombing of Lebanese villages by Israel since the 1980s, the 1985 killing of Arab American activist Alex Ode by suspected American Jewish extremists, the Serbian Genocide against Bosnians in the early 1990s, the World Trade Center bombing by followers of Sheikh Omar Abdulrahman in 1993, the bombing of civilian bases in Israel by members of the military wings of Hamas and Islamic Jihad, which began after the 1994 Hebron massacre of Palestinians by a Jewish settler, the Oklahoma City bombing by Timothy McVeigh in 1995, etc. End of quote. The role that MPAC played in condemning terrorism might have won them a seat in Washington, as their director Salam Al-Marayati was nominated by U.S. Representative Richard Gifford to serve on a federal terrorism prevention commission. In spite of Al-Marayati's scholarly credentials, the nomination was withdrawn under pressure exerted by a pro-Israel lobby. They grounded on the grounds that Al-Marayati was a constant critic of Israel for its mistreatment of Palestinians. The 1990s saw also the emergence of the Council on American Islamic Relations. It was established in 1994 to defend ordinary American Muslims in cases of discrimination and to bring them to a sense of awareness of their rights as citizens in a free and pluralistic society. CARE's leap into prominence as a watchdog organization for American Muslim civil liberties was occasioned by a media rush to judgment after the Oklahoma City bombing perpetrated by an angry American Christian on April the 19th, 1995. In the aftermath of the events, CARE published a report about more than 200 incidents of hate crimes the community complained about. Realizing that the report a rush to judgment received media coverage by such national outlets as the New York Times and the ABC World News Tonight, CARE adopted the same strategy in the 1996 report titled The Usual Suspect, published after a similar rush to judgment by the American media and officials in linking the crash of the TWA Flight 800 to terrorists from the Middle East. In the 1990s, the discourse of public advocacy in general, of public advocacy organizations, seemed to involve, for the most part, the elite from the Muslim communities in dialogue with the political elite in America. The mobilization of the American Muslim electorate seems to be absent for the most part. These electorate, whose knowledge of leadership was still limited to the person of the local imam, who generally would minister to their spiritual needs and would at best be indifferent to politics, and at worst exhort them not to worship the idol of the state, or not to elect an Arab or Muslim American running for office because of his Christian name or because he did not have a beard. The shift came with the emergence of the American Muslim Alliance in the late 1990s. It aimed to build bridges between the Muslim electorate and their representatives, who were not aware of a growing electoral base that might influence the outcome of the elections. Their main mission was to prepare to exhort American Muslims to use their right to vote. The peak came when Agha Saeed, the founder, chairman of the American Muslim Alliance, organized the presidential bloc vote by Muslims in the 2000 presidential election. If Agha Saeed's success attests to something, certainly it is the triumph of the late 1990s coalition-building initiatives between Arab American organizations and American Muslim organizations. Indeed, in the late 1990s, the American Muslim Public Affairs groups built a coalition that gave birth to the American Muslim Political Coordination Council, which is AMPCC. Jerusalem was the cement of the coalition, as the coalition soon endorsed the establishment of American Muslims for Jerusalem in 1999 to make Americans aware of the importance of Jerusalem in the Islamic faith. Of course, needless to mention that it is modeled on a Jewish precedent. Jerusalem did also bring ISNA and the ministry of W.D. Muhammad to and the Council of Presidents of Arab American Organizations to the orbit of the AMJ. Yet, beside Jerusalem, the late 1990s witnessed the emergence of a civic domestic agenda that provided another bond linking these organizations, the Muslim organizations and the Arab American organizations. The twin components of this domestic agenda were secret evidence and voter registration. Because of the discriminatory load that was associated with secret evidence, it provided a civic cause that did not only reinforce coalition building between Muslim and Arab groups, but also between American Muslim public advocacy groups and civil rights organizations. The trend found its best expression after the passage of the 1996 Anti-Terrorism and Effective Penalty Act, as Arab Americans who had already had well-established tradition of cooperation with Muslim civil rights organizations and American Muslim groups worked in tandem with the American Civil Liberties Union. The coalition fought desperately for the repeal of the act, yet their efforts were crippled by the post-9/11 tougher security measures under the USA Patriot Act. In the aftermath of 9/11, of the terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center, American Muslim organizations issued in an unprecedented way public statements condemning the attacks. Their voices might not have reached their fellow Americans in the first few days amidst the traumatic fear that cut right across the country, but their act was highly considered by American politicians as President Bush visited the Islamic Center in Washington, D.C. and declared Islam publicly a religion of peace. Bush's speech threw into relief the healing effect of rhetoric that drove many Americans out of the maze of ignorance about a religion, some of whom had not been aware of its presence on the American soil. So authoritative was Bush's edict that 61% of Americans say they know little about religion, yet 57% of them don't believe Islam teaches violence. This is according to a poll held by ABC News and BelieveNet in January 2002. The speech had certainly a palliative effect on the Muslim community, who found themselves not only subject to hate crimes, but also to mass detentions and deportations. And the situation got worse as these measures became institutionalized with the passage of the USA Patriot Act. The discriminatory aspect of the measures taken by the government against Arab and Muslim nationals, the shift in the tone of some government officials, like Attorney General, for example, who stated that Islam is a religion in which God requires you to send your son to die for him. Christianity is a faith in which God sends his son to die for you. The double standard that the government did not shun during the April 2002 Palestinian-Israeli crisis and Bush's failure, according to some Muslim organizations, to denounce anti-Muslim comments by conservative Christians, occasioned a sudden shift in the strategies adopted by American Muslim public advocacy organizations from courting officials to mass grassroots activism. Most Muslim public affairs organizations work to strengthen the spirit of solidarity that had been born around secret evidence, and with many ethnic and civil rights groups who had hardly had any ties with American Muslims prior to the attacks, and who saw in the post-9/11 atmosphere of suspicion against Arab American citizens a reopening of past wounds. And these new groups included Japanese Americans and African Americans. The alliance extended to include even local enforcement and political officials and human rights activists. What linked them all was their concern about the erosion of the constitutional rights of all Americans, a new crack in the covenant that the founding fathers of this country made with God. Perhaps the coalition that Impact built around the civil liberties on January the 14th, 2002, was one of the earliest expressions of an alternative politics that the American Muslim public advocacy organizations tried to forward as an alternative to the atmosphere of suspicion. The press conference it held on the occasion in the Islamic Center of Southern California to share with civic groups, civil liberty advocacy organizations, and representatives of various ethnic minorities the rising concerns over the status of civil liberties was attended by Dr. Maher Hathout of Impact, Aslam Abdullah of the Minaret magazine, Stephen Road, president of the ACLU Southern California, Mark Mazuka, chair of Japanese American NCRR, Hussam Ailouche of CARE. Lack of disclosure and the information information regarding the detainees arrested after 9/11, the lack of due legal process and the singling out of Arab Americans and Muslim Americans, and the contemplation of an alternative counterterrorism policy to target suspects while preserving the democratic traditions of our great society, says Al-Marayati, were the objectives of this alliance. Impact's press conference provided a kind of model a malleable model that was to a large extent replicated in subsequent Muslim public organizations, conferences, and gatherings, and even affected certain gatherings of organizations that can be labeled as community development organizations. And one of the best examples I think, to attest to this is the annual conference of ISNA in August the 30th, from August the 30th and September the 2nd, 2002. The theme of the conference was Islam, a call for peace and justice. The annual conference reflected in some of its newly introduced panels almost the same themes that one would expect a public affairs organization to manifest. Speakers from IMPAC and from the NAACP, from the ACLU were invited to speak. And given, of course, the opportunity to speak in this conference, which is the largest gathering of American Muslims, and it was organized by ISNA to achieve to bring together. It's the first gathering after 9/11, and it was, of course, organized by ISNA to bring Muslims together. And the fact that in such a gathering, which was before 9/11 mainly oriented toward explaining Islam and studying the religion, the fact that it included it had a kind of political tone translated to the wider audience the seriousness of the condition and that the Muslim community is going through. The grimness of the situation was presented in the detail 3 months later in the annual conference of the Muslim Public Affairs Council. Although no speakers in the panels about religion was identified with ISNA, the myriad of speakers who participated in the panels were very religiously, ethnically, politically, and gender diverse. Working for the future of Islam was the theme of the organization. One might ask the question how. The answer is provided in the conference. The answer is building a nationwide coalition to repeal the USA Patriot Act. Indeed, the Patriot Act was dissected and exposed in almost all the panels by civil rights activists, lawyers, under the watchful eyes of government and law enforcement officials, who at times found themselves teased by the audience and fellow panels. Such fellow panels as was the case of Randy Parson of the FBI. The conference was held a few days after the first wave immigrants from countries in the Middle East were required under the new anti-terrorism law to register with the INS in California, a campaign that ended up in the detention of hundreds, most of whom were of Iranian descent. Nowhere in the conference was the fear of the audience displayed as it was when they thronged around the panelists of Session 4, entitled The Patriot Act and the Silent War on Civil Liberties. They thronged around the panels, asking them for guidance on how to proceed, and the second registration round was scheduled on January the 10th. The panel's promise, I quote, "We will be with you," was of utmost importance to them. Indeed, on January the 4th, 2003, under the leadership of CARE, the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee, the Alliance of Iranian Americans, and the National Council of Pakistani Americans, more than 300 protesters gathered in front of the INS district office in downtown Los Angeles. The demonstrators called the INS to call off its second mandatory registration of non-resident aliens scheduled for January the 10th. Some of the signs that they brandished, like INS equals KKK, INS witch hunt of immigrants is terrorism, I am an Iranian American with Iranian written in lowercase and American in big case, and capitalized, World War II Japanese Americans, today Iranian Americans, evoke dark spots in the history of the U.S. when it departed from its ideals and for which it stands. On Friday, January the 10th, sponsored by the Muslim Public Affairs Council, MPAC, Southern Asian Network, SAN, the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee, IDC, and the American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU, and CARE, a shield of human rights monitors wearing yellow packed MPAC T-shirts, attempted to take the names of Middle Eastern men entering the INS building. Though the January the 4th march showed that influencing the decision process remains a pious declaration of hope, the January the 10th monitoring showed that influencing its outcome was possible. Whereas at the first registration on December the 16th, an estimate 700 Middle Easterners were detained, a few men appeared to be arrested on January the 10th. So successful was the monitoring campaign that it received a wide media coverage and turned into a nationwide campaign recruiting a growing number of Gen Xers who were attracted to MPAC's INS monitor training workshops. In conclusion, the mass detentions, voluntary interviews with American Muslims and Arabs, the INS registration measures, among other measures undertaken by the government to track terrorists, have so far led almost to no open evidence as to the existence of any terrorist links between Arab and Muslim Americans or non-residents of Arab and Middle Eastern origins and the 9/11 attacks. On the contrary, they gained them as a minority, a wider basis of sympathizers. The two Southern California INS officers' immigrant file burning scandal that led to the detention of hundreds of immigrants at the first call-in, the resurgence of a new wave of voluntary interviews of 11,000 Iraqi nationals during the Second War with Iraq, and its concomitant increase of anti-Muslim Arab Iraqi-American hate crimes, the leaks of Patriot 2 and the seeming coincidence between the rise of the terrorist threat and American foreign policy in the Middle East have convinced many American Muslim public activists that the reverberations of the shock America felt on September the 11th have not stopped resonating and will continue to resonate as long as the country continues to be splintering into preconstructed lines of hatred that is hidden under the cloak of patriotism, a hatred channeled towards non-Americans. Of course, this represents fractures in the ideological construct in American identity that have always existed in times of crisis and have always given the opportunity to outsiders to fight zealously to mend them in the process of their making as Americans and to nativists to widen them. American Muslims are following the path that other hyphenated Americans have trodden before. The challenge is how effectively American Muslim public advocacy groups can convince isolationists within their communities and nativists outside their communities or in the society at large that the hyphen that bridges the American and the outsider can be turned into a channel or a bridge rather than a barrier. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Dan Michon, and Rahuldeep Singh Gill and I have worked together in studying the public face of Sikhism in Southern California. Our work began in October of 2002, and it will continue through the summer, so today we present a study in progress. Great. As I've been listening to the different presentations, it's becoming clear that it really is a study in progress. As I've picked up something from everybody's presentations that I have to include in the final report, so it's going to make it more difficult. Whether it be from Vince's idea of memorialization, which fits very well with the Sikh community, Balbir Singh Sodhi, who was killed in Arizona right after September 11th because he was mistaken, because the turban was identified with the Taliban. his memorialization fits into exactly what Vince was saying about a way for a minority ethnic community to gain public space, to contest public space. Or whether it was Professor Heck's deconstruction of urban life and urban centers as a way of working on, in a way of bringing religions closer together just because of space. And Rahul Deep will actually, we had some ideas of this last night, and Rahul Deep will touch on the difference between Sikh public faces in the cities like LA and Sikh public faces in other communities like in Caruthers, Fresno, which is a more agricultural farming community. And you'll see different expressions of Sikhism, and we think, and we'll work this out later more, but we think maybe because of the constraints of the city or the closeness of the city at the same time versus agricultural. We're talking about Gustav Niebuhr's outline of the 4 points of religious pluralism in the United States. That got me thinking about how Sikhism fits some of those points, and I will try to bring in a couple of them later, how Sikhism exemplifies what's going on a larger level. Or even Saba's mentioning of the insularity, I hope I can use that word, the insularity of the Persian Jewish community, and how does the Sikh community, are they insular, are they not, and how does that work itself out? So this is a preliminary study. We're going to have to think about these things and work them in. But first, let me say just a few words about, I promised Rahul Deep I would put this in. This is the public face of Sikhism. There he is in front of Gill Chevrolet at a mela in Fresno. So,
thanks, Dan.
Yeah, you're welcome. We had to put that in there. So let me just break down the community quickly, as it's not as well known as the other communities. We would break it down into two distinct communities in Southern California. There's Punjabi American Sikhs and Anglo-American Sikhs. You can see the numbers. They're pretty rough estimates, but probably between 50,000 and 70,000 in California. Most of them in the Fresno, Yuba City area of Punjabi American Sikhs. Then you have what I'm calling Anglo-American Sikhs, who are members of Sikh Dharma, or also on their website called White Tantric Yoga, a group formed by Yogi Bhajan in the 1960s. And while they're small in number in Los Angeles, they're quite influential. And while part of their practice, such as their focus on Kundalini Yoga, separates them from Punjabi Sikhs, they also have much in common. They look to the same scripture, they look to the same gurus, they wear turbans as well, so they keep some of the same practices, etc. And when we first thought about the project, we set it up as, well, we're not going to talk about Sikh Dharma, the white Sikh population. We're just going to interview Punjabi Sikhs. But it became clear as we were doing our research that even though it's a small in number, in Los Angeles itself, they have quite an influence. They're out there presenting the public face of Sikhism very aggressively. And you can see this in a number of ways, whether it be their website, which is quite elaborate, and you would never know that this was a very small group putting on this website, to their influence in the Vaisakhi Festival that we visited in the Civic Center, which Rahul Deep will talk about the differences between a Vaisakhi festival that occurs in the city of LA versus one that occurs in Fresno in a more agricultural community. So, and then even within the Punjabi American Sikh population, I identified three distinct public faces of that as well. There's an older generation that's centered around the Gurdwara as a social institution. There's a group of younger professionals who go to Gurdwara occasionally, but still hold on to their Sikh and Punjabi culture. And then there's the youth, 16 to 22-year-olds, especially on college campuses, who have used their Sikh identity as an interesting public identifier. However, despite these public faces, we did come across one consistent ideal that goes across all these groups. No matter who we talked to, at some point they made it clear that they perceived that their Sikh religious values derived from the teachings of the gurus, a half millennia and a half a world removed from Southern California in the 21st century, to be consistent with an idealized set of traditional American values. And as one Punjabi Sikh that I interviewed at the North Hollywood Gurdwara told me, Americans should love the Sikhs as they stand for everything that America stands for. And we heard this sentiment over and over again in different ways, some very strong like this, not so strong, but somehow matching up Sikh religious values with this thing called American values, which we also have to figure out what they mean by that. So what do they mean by this? Well, Daljit Singh went on further. And he identified the core values of Guru Nanak, the first Sikh Guru. And these are the values that Guru Nanak professed that match up perfectly with American values. Hard work, loving all, love of all colors, love of all religions, helping the poor rise to the top, honesty and piety. And he understood these very values also to lie at the heart of Americanness. Thus, Sikhs make ideal Americans, and many Sikhs attribute the success of the community in America to this fortuitous match in values. Yesterday, Gustav Niebuhr, in his keynote address, identified 4 characteristics of religious pluralism in the U.S. The first was religious diversity is highly public, it's highly visible. And this visibility, and number 2, this visibility is dealt with in 2 different ways. On the one hand, there's those who see this diversity as negative, as something that will break apart the American community, something that will fragment it irreconcilably. But there also is a widespread effort at the local level to portray this diversity as positive, as something strengthening America as an asset. I think clearly the Sikh population, this cuts across all the different groups I just mentioned, see Sikhs falling into the latter category. They're actively promoting the idea that diversity is a positive force for America. Americans should see Sikhs as allies, not enemies, to the strength of society. In fact, one gets the impression that Sikhs can be a model for Americans, inculcating the idea of piousness, religious tolerance, and humility in their work and devotion, and this devotion is to both God and nation. And we came across a number of people talking about devotion to the nation, to America, as a touchstone to return to some of the traditional values that made this a great nation. And again, I think we see point number 3 from Gustav Niebuhr's talk yesterday, that this idea that diversity is somehow is an American tradition. And here, Daljit Singh was calling that up, saying, listen, this idea of religious tolerance, of loving all religions, is something that America had and made this country great, and we bring that to the table. That's part of our tradition already, and these match up perfectly. So, this idea of humility in work and devotion has a genealogy for Sikhism, and is embodied in the ideal of the Sikh saint soldier. And this ideal was invoked in a number of interviews with different Sikhs, especially in Los Angeles. And I get the feeling that it had been talked about around the Gurdwara, because I heard it from almost everybody I talked to, especially the older generation, all referred to the saint soldier or the sant soldier. In Sikhism, the sant soldier is a Punjabi warrior who combines religious devotion with a warrior's strength. He is righteous in his defense of freedom for the hardworking, pious members of the community. And there's some iconography that goes with it of the sant soldier, somebody who stands up for justice and right. These are just a few things we pulled off the web to show that. And now look at this image. This comes from sikhnet.com, which is the Anglo-American Sikh community. So this is not the Punjabi American community putting this out there, but this is very prominent on their website, which is a very large website. And it says in the bottom, American Sikh warrior defending freedom. And what you have is you can see the same, I tried to show the horses, not the battle scenes, but the image of the horse with the rider on top put against an American flag. So here we have the saint soldier being intertwined with American icons, at least in the Anglo-Sikh community, to give new life and meaning to this traditional image. The poster implies that the saint soldier is just as relevant here in America as he is in Punjab. He's just as relevant in the 21st century as he was in the 17th and 18th century. He is here to defend universal values recognized by both Sikhism and American society. In this public face of Sikhism, at least, differences are minimized and similarities are emphasized. Finally, this ideal of the saint soldier does not remain in the realm of abstract ideas, but is actively sought out right here in Los Angeles. Just recently, Sikhs petitioned the Los Angeles Police Department to allow Sikhs to enter the police force while maintaining their beard and turban. The LAPD has agreed, and in the near future we might, I say might because we don't know what's going to happen, but we might see Sikh policemen not clean-shaven in police hats, but in full beard and turban, literally protecting the freedoms that Americans so cherish. Interestingly, when you go to India, and especially Northwest India, this has been a typical role of Sikhs in Punjab. They were part of the British Army. And so the Sikh as a defender of a nation is pervasive in India. And we can see here, at least the older generation of Sikhs would like to see Sikhs functioning in the same role in America. Whether the younger generation answers this call is open and an interesting question. We do know that the two that we went to after this call was made, it happened about a couple weeks ago, they're actually putting up calls for young Sikhs to enter the police force. And on these posters it tells what kind of skills you need, what the pay scale is, these kinds of things. And so there's an attempt to get Sikhs younger Sikhs to join the police force in LA. And the two Gurdwaras we went to, they were both up there on the bulletin boards. And so we assume it was a LA-wide effort. So here we see, so whether the younger generation answers this call or not, it's nonetheless clear that part of the Sikh community would like to participate in the most fundamental law enforcement institutions in America. Okay, I will stop there, and I'll turn over to Rahul Deep. I just presented some uniting forces of the public face of Sikhism, and he will present a couple different faces that we discovered. Can we stay up here? Yeah.
Thanks, Dan. Dan and I started our research project asking the question, what is the public face of Sikhism? Aside from doing personal interviews with California Sikhs, we visited 2 Sikh celebrations held on consecutive weekends, one in Los Angeles and one in Fresno County. Both events celebrated Vaisakhi, which is a Punjabi celebration of the harvest that takes on heightened religious meaning for the Sikhs at the end of the 17th century. Sikh history narrates that in 1699, at a Vaisakhi celebration, the 10th and final Sikh Guru Gobind Singh formed the Khalsa, initiated order of committed Sikhs who were to hold steadfast to a prescribed code of, which included wearing 5 markers of faith, of which turban and hair are one. Comparing 2 Vaisakhi celebrations, we found that Sikhs consistently identify Sikh values with American values, as was Dan's point earlier. However, diversity within and between those communities requires us to talk about the public faces of Sikhism. The Los Angeles and Fresno County religious communities display their public faces in very different ways and in their Vaisakhi celebrations. Here we have a quote from a young Sikh youth leader in Fresno who's saying, in urban environments, the religious consciousness is more pronounced because other people are more up in your face. What does this mean? Let's unpack the differences between the 2 Vaisakhi celebrations we visited, and I'll come back to this slide after we do that. The usual Sunday events at all major Los Angeles area Gurdwaras converged on April 13th at one combined celebration at the city's convention center in the heart of downtown. The day's events took up 2 massive rooms, each capable of accommodating a few thousand worshipers, connected by a few hundred square feet of hallway. In one room housed the religious services, the Kirtan Darbar. In this room, arriving worshipers paid their obeisance to the Sikh scripture and eternal Guru, the Adi Granth. Here, Sikh hymns as well as non-scriptural ballads were scheduled to be sung by various professional musicians from 4 a.m. onward. Children were given a chunk of time to display what they had prepared to sing. Speakers and preachers were there. And considering all these elements, it was a fairly typical Punjabi Sikh religious service. But myself, as a practicing Sikh, raised visiting both Punjabi and Anglo-Sikh communities, as Dan drew the distinction earlier, some aspects of the Sikh Dharma or Anglo-Sikh's influence were also evident to me. Some examples of the service that struck me as slightly unusual for Punjabi Sikh services is perhaps attestable to the Sikh Dharma's influences are as follows. For one, the tastefully white lighting and reverent religious atmosphere. At large Punjabi Sikh gatherings, especially celebrations like Vaisakhi, those celebrations are often bright, loud, chaotic, instead of solemn and reserved like this one seemed. That's just something from my from my childhood and how I was raised, something that I noticed. Foot dryers. When you walk into the Sikh Gurdwara, and in the space that's marketed as sacred, where as you're sort of walking to bow in front of the Guru, the holy scriptures, you take off your shoes. And there are usually, sometimes there's pans of water there where you can dip your feet and cleanse them in whatever way. That's not an uncommon thing. They had those here. But what they also had here was manual foot dryers with people with towels who were drying people's feet. I had never seen that before at a Punjabi Sikh celebration, even though most of the people here are Punjabi. They were some Anglo-Sikhs. So these foot dryers are not common volunteers in all services. The 5 beloved ones is another distinction. Behind the platform where the Guru Granth, the scripture, rested, sat the Panj Pyare, or 5 Khalsa-initiated Sikhs, who represent the Sikh communities at large. This institution is connected with the important Vaisakhi Festival of 1699, where the final living Sikh Guru culminated the Sikh Khalsa fraternity. Again, this is not something you see in most Gurdwara services, probably because it was Vaisakhi. It was, someone made a point to have those 5 people representing the people behind the Guru, behind the scripture. Although the first Panj Pyare were male, the institution has not been interpreted as gender restrictive. Certainly the Los Angeles service of April 13th exhibited a group mixed by both race and gender. A video hagiography. The singing of hymns was paused for a while the life history of the 10th Guru, Guru Gobind Singh, was presented in a video format on 2 large screens at the front. Now, telling of stories and preaching that are just not musical is not uncommon, but this is the first time I had seen a multimedia preaching, or multimedia hagiography in a Gurdwara service, so that was a bit unusual to me. Okay. In the hallway connecting the 2 large rooms, tables were set up where information was made available, and donations were accepted to help offset the cost of the day's events. And then visitors filed into the second massive room. It was I think it was an exhibit hall at the convention center. They filed into this massive room, which was reserved, where they enjoyed langar, the Sikh communal meal, which was served all day. In the periphery of this room, though, a couple other things were happening. There was a blood drive going on. An organization was taking blood donations in a partitioned area at the back of the room. There was a bone marrow search going on. Visitors were encouraged to help find a bone marrow donor for one particular Sikh gentleman, and in the process register on a national database. There were vendors in another part of the room where Anglo and Punjabi Sikhs together, the merchants sold religious books, tapes, recordings of hymns, jewelry, art, etc. So our question is, how does the public face of Sikhism change based on locale? This is a public face of, part of the public face of Sikhism at the Caruthers Vaisakhi Mela in Fresno County. While the Los Angeles Sikhs celebrated Vaisakhi solemnly and piously, the Caruthers Mela seemed a lot less concerned with overtly religious themes. Here we have a group of elderly men in an area partitioned off for racing, foot racing each other to win these prestigious medals that were given later in the day. This guy won. They had a rematch because one guy got mad for some reason, but the other guy won again anyways. There are about 10,000 to 11,000 Sikhs in Fresno County who visit 7 Gurdwaras. The oldest of those Gurdwaras is 16 years old. Some Sikhs came to Central California as early as the early part of the last century, but a lot of those people returned to Punjab. The present community in Fresno is made up of a new wave of immigrants dating as far back as the 60s and 70s, comparable to the Los Angeles community. Like the community in Punjab, this present community in Fresno County is highly agricultural. It's made up of farmers, laborers, tractor mechanics, insurers of farmland, and all these people were there at the festival that we visited. The festival was held on the lawn of a Gurdwara, next to a vineyard. The back lawn was about the size of 2 football fields. Underneath a white tent, crowds gathered to watch proceedings on a stage. Outside the large tents, there was ample room for, as you can see, visitors to gather and talk and laugh. And here's some kids playing. There's ice cream trucks. There's people playing, like, just doing those carnival games or shooting baskets. And there are merchant slides. Similar to what was going on in LA, but, you know, it was a lemonade stand there. There's, you know, sick art was available, all these kinds of things. When we arrived mid-morning, the foot races were taking place outside the tent, and inside the tent, a trio of professional singers were singing the heroic deeds of Sikh warriors. We need to mention that the tent was about half full. It didn't look anything like this when we got there, while the singers were singing about, you know, these sort of religious themes. At one point, a gentleman got up on stage to announce the festival's lost and found situation. Apparently, someone had lost some keys, and someone's child had been found, separated from her mother. He said, and I translate from the Punjabi, "If this happens to you, come tell us. Keep telling us as these things happen throughout the day. Don't be shy. We'll get your family reunited." It's even funnier in Punjabi. So here we're talking inside the tent. After the athletic contest, the cultural program commenced, and it consisted of singing and CD playing of popular folk songs, children's cultural dances, interspersed with jocular comments in Punjabi by the master of ceremonies. There seemed to be no special religious service to commemorate Vaisakhi the next day even, just standard Gurdwara services and a wedding, as we found. Here's some more pictures of these are the ice cream truck guys, and this is the race area. One middle-aged Sikh gentleman told me that the Caruthers Festival was probably the biggest celebration of Vaisakhi of any kind in the entire Fresno vicinity for this year. There was a parade the weekend before in nearby Selma, which had an estimated turnout of about 4,000 to 5,000 people, whereas this Mela here estimated about 5,000 to 6,000. This informant, and his name is Sharanjit Singh, told me he wanted more religious programs. But he said, people aren't interested in that. People are more interested in the games, the competitions, the Bhangra, which is the folk dance of Punjab. They call it a children's Mela. They say it's for the kids to teach them religion and culture, but it seems more cultural. In this paper, we're not calling into question the religiosity or the sincerity of any of the communities or their members. What we are saying is that the expressions of piety and religiosity seem to differ in the locale studied, and we attribute these differences to a few causes. Maybe we just went on the wrong days. But the coexistence of ethnically Punjabi Sikhs and Sikh Dharma in Los Angeles seemed to change things. The urban versus rural thing that Harinder Sandhu brought up earlier seemed to change things. And perhaps what this seemed to change is that in the Fresno community, which is rural, you sort of have a closed-off group. Because there are enough Sikhs, you can walk down the street and see a few Sikhs. You know, like the community's more closed in versus in the LA where the community has to work harder to control its public face. According to what Harinder Sandhu was saying, presumably the Fresno community hasn't had to redefine itself in the face of some dangerous otherness, as would take place in an urban environment. So in conclusion of my part, and Dan will talk to you briefly to really wrap things up, the theoretical questions that we're asking here is firstly, what do we mean the Sikh perspective in America? What do we mean, what is the public face of Sikhism? Perhaps faces is a more accurate way to think about even one community. Perhaps as the differences between Fresno and Los Angeles, as the differences between the celebrations taught us, the diversity of America's own landscape compounds the diversity of the immigrant communities that settle here. And I'll turn it over to Dan.
I think time is probably short, so should we move on?
How much time do you need?
I could take a lot, but
Don't.
2 minutes.
I'll say one word.
Go ahead.
I promise to be 2 sentences.
One.
I was just going to conclude with some, let's see, we just had some more images of the uniting of Sikhism and in America, this kind of idea of bringing them together. Here's a girl that's a, and then I was going to go into trying to control the public face of Sikhism. I just wanted to bring it up that there has been Sikhs, especially urban Sikhs, have taken a keen interest in how Sikhs are portrayed in the media. And this was a video game called Hitman 2 where they had Sikhs walking around killing people in a thing that looks like the Darbar Sahib at at Amritsar, and there was a huge protest, and they actually got this game changed, and it's not going to be released. Then I also promised we'd get him in the end, too. Also, there's a movie called Dysfunctional Family, where a Sikh is called Bin Laden with a turban. However, Miramax refuses to take that scene out. So they've been successful in some cases, for example, with this video game, in controlling the image of Sikhs in the public sphere. But in other cases, the media giant Miramax they have taken it out of the commercial. They used that scene where someone calls a Sikh Bin Laden. It was playing in all their commercials for this family and for all the trailers in theaters. It was a point they were trying to sell the movie, and they thought, it's interesting. They were trying to sell the one scene they show, or one of the key scenes is this scene. So they took it out of the trailer, out of the commercials, but they've left it in the movie. So I think we're running out of time, so we have more to say, but we'll leave it for the paper. Thank you.
Most of the presentations we've heard so far today really are about groups that have been very public and increasingly involved in civic life. And the group that I'm covering today violates that pattern. It's a group that has not really achieved much of a public face and has not gotten that much involved in civic life, although there is some effort to try and move in that direction. I got interested in the African immigrant religions when just recently we celebrated the holiday memorializing the birthday of Martin Luther King Jr., and following that, the events that took place during the month of February to celebrate Black American history. These were two very public events that demonstrated dramatically the profound impact that African Americans have had on American civic life. But I began to wonder where the more recent African immigrants fit into that picture, if at all. Do the African immigrants identify with African American culture, with its heroes, its holidays, its politics? Do the African immigrant religions adopt profiles similar to those of African American religions in terms of mobilizing political, economic, and social resources on behalf of their constituents? How do African immigrants negotiate identity in the context of a cultural milieu still characterized by racial thinking? My general findings are that African immigrants and African immigrant churches, although they are concentrated in predominantly black neighborhoods, appear to identify very little with African Americans or with African American culture and institutions. The reason is not surprising. It lies in the fact that whereas African American identity, religion, and politics developed in response to a long history of racism in the United States, African immigrant culture is not characterized by the same racial thinking. Let me elaborate just a little bit. I asked all of the African ministers that I interviewed whether their churches celebrated Martin Luther King Jr. Day. Most of them did not. The few that did celebrate this holiday are those that have some African Americans in their congregations, although this is rather rare. But even then, the holiday is divorced from the African American identity. Martin Luther King Jr. is not celebrated in these churches as a great black American. He's celebrated as a great American. One bishop of a Pan-African Pentecostal church based in Lagos, Nigeria, for example, explained that his congregations recognizes all of the American holidays as occasions to pray for the nation. These are his words. Every holiday in this United States, we are involved because we are part and parcel. Because though we have some immigrants, we have citizens, Americans, both white and black. It's not just for outsiders, it's for this country. This month, we prayed for this nation. By next Sunday, we'll be praying for the nations of Africa. His colleague, a pastor visiting from Nigeria, who had joined us for the discussion, further elaborated. The church is not so much into the promotion of any culture or races. There is no racial emphasis of any kind in this place. So the public holidays, like that for Martin Luther King, are observed in the whole nation. There is no special emphasis that is laid on the black race or anything like that. A pastor from Ghana summed it up very simply. A few of these churches, they do celebrate Martin Luther King Jr. Day. The majority don't care. However, there is some movement toward positioning the African immigrant communities as a new chapter in African American history, and this is a very interesting thing that I think we want to keep our eyes on in the future. The Assemblies of God pastor from Ghana that I just cited went on to explain that the African Ministries Association, of which he was the founding president, had recently decided to celebrate the anniversary of their association in February to correspond with the overall African History Month activities. This decision was an attempt by the association's current president, whose congregation is also attempting to bridge the gap between African Americans and African immigrants, to try to bridge that gap in the African Ministries Association, although so far it has attracted only one African American member who is a personal friend of the former president. In fact, there appears to be some tension between African immigrants and African Americans. One pastor I spoke to described how he and his family had moved away from a black neighborhood because they felt unwelcomed there. We used to live in a typical African American community here in Los Angeles, in Compton, he said. Very typical, one of the strongest African American neighborhoods. And many times they broadly accused us, me and my family, that we don't want to blend with them. We said we do have the desire to blend, but there's too much stuff out there. The stuff out there was that there was these problems with drugs, people hanging out every day, hanging out, talking, fighting, arguing, so much vice. And I have children. So we just had to do the best we could. We tried to bridge the gap, but we couldn't break through. Indeed, many of the African leaders I spoke with see maintaining an African identity as insulating their children from the perceived negative consequences of exposure to the environment of black neighborhoods. One pastor remarked, "That's where the parents get really scared. That's why they want to inculcate the culture, the African culture, so that they don't hook up, their children don't hook up to the vices, the wrong friends, the wrong company. That is the major fear." He further commented that their greatest hope lies in the combination of American education and African values, and the challenge is somehow to try and hold these two together. Right now, he said, the solution that parents adopt is that they are turning to African pastors' churches. Some go so far as to take extended vacations with their children to Africa when they perceive that their children are becoming too Americanized. This pattern of attempting to sustain an African identity as a way of insulating youth against the potentially harmful influences of American culture is most pronounced among the Ethiopians. The Ethiopians were the only Africans I spoke to during my research who identified themselves in terms of a specific national or ethnic identity rather than simply as Africans. One Ethiopian pastor remarked that the stronger the sense of Ethiopian identity, the more likely their children would be able to resist the negative impact of American culture. In his words, that's why the community, that's why the church, that's why the belongingness, that's why the identity. I think the young people belong to their own identity. We don't see them mixing. We don't see them trying to adopt. These young professionals said they know that their identity is Ethiopian, not as American or as people who have been born here. Other Africans I spoke to affirmed that the Ethiopians tend to stay by themselves. They rarely, if ever, mix with other Africans, let alone African Americans. None of the Ethiopian pastors I spoke to had even ever heard about the African Ministries Association. The strongest feelings I uncovered about intermingling with African Americans were expressed when I asked about intermarriage. Uniformly, the pastors agreed it was a bad idea. To quote one of them, a majority of those who intermarried with African Americans don't have peace in their home. In fact, there are some of our people from Africa, parents, who would do everything to stop their children from marrying an African American. An Ethiopian pastor had this to say: "I think a cross-cultural marriage should be done in a very thoughtful decision because there are so many factors that come up. Mixed marriages are really difficult." When I asked him how parents would respond if their child came home and introduced what they hoped would be a future spouse who is not Ethiopian, what those parents would say, he said, "I expect them to say, I think, have you really considered it? Have you thought about it? Have you deliberated in the presence of God? Why don't you discuss it, the pros and cons of it, and come up with a decision?" I think every Ethiopian family would prefer their own kids to marry Ethiopians because of the consequences that will come out of being a mixed marriage. Marriage, this pastor said, is not just a unification of two people, it's a bond of communities. And if the feelings about intermarriage between Africans and African Americans is a good indicator of that, the Africans are not yet ready to bond their communities with those of African Americans. However, this too may be changing. Most of the people I spoke to indicated that differences and the associated tensions between Africans and African Americans are more pronounced among the older first-generation adults than among younger people raised in the United States. Given the pervasiveness of African American culture and American popular culture, this is hardly surprising. One Ethiopian pastor further down south in Anaheim that I spoke to even said that he expected for this reason that within a generation his church might be obsolete. And of course, education has a big role to play in this as well. The more highly educated Africans and African Americans tend to get along better with each other than the others. A significant reason that the Africans and African Americans in Southern California don't identify with each other is not surprising. The Africans don't share with African Americans the history and cultural memory of race issues in the United States and the political commitments that have attended that memory. Virtually everyone I spoke to pointed out that Africans just don't think in terms of race. To quote one, "We don't know what is called race in Nigeria." Another, an Ethiopian pastor, described an encounter he had with an African American teacher in a panel discussion. "He was so proud that I am from Ethiopia. He thinks the gospel went to Ethiopia through the Ethiopian eunuch, and he wanted to hear more about that. I could care less personally, but when I analyzed why he was so much into that, more than that he was inspired by the gospel, he was inspired by the discrimination between black and white. What was important to him was that it's not the white people, it's the black person, the Ethiopian black guy who brought the gospel to Ethiopia. To me, it doesn't really matter. I don't care who brought it." His inspiration was to say, it's the black people who brought the gospel to Africa. For him, that was a matter of black pride. But if you ask any Ethiopian, they wouldn't even know that story. Another pastor from Ghana elaborated this way, and I think very insightfully. "I think they, the African Americans, have a history behind them. They have lived with institutional conditions that have passed on to them from generations past. With very little provocation, their whole system is aroused. From the start, they see something racial, which we don't see. They will catch you. They will see stuff that we don't see and we don't mind, something that an African can tolerate, whether it is prejudice or animosity or whatever. Something that will take us so much to see, they will recognize when it is just a speck like that." He pinched his fingers together to indicate something very tiny. "And I think it is because of the past they have gone through, which we didn't. We do face different kinds of racial stuff every now and then, but it doesn't hit us like it does them." In fact, one of the interesting things I uncovered is that apparently this absence of racial sensitivity may actually have the effect of insulating African immigrants from present discrimination. This Ghanaian pastor went on to say, you know, we don't say I'm not an African American, but when you speak, everybody knows. The moment you speak, whoever is born in Africa and comes here, we speak with accents. So it's easy to detect. It's easy to find us out. I have met with some white people, and in the beginning they were very apprehensive. But then, when I began speaking with an accent, they relaxed. We have seen it over and over again. We have recognized that some white Americans are more apprehensive when they know it's an African American than when they know he's pure African. That lack of identification between African Americans and Africans can have at least potentially both positive and negative consequences in terms of civic involvement. On the positive side, and here a reviewer of this paper from over in the Black Studies Department here on this campus questioned my optimistic viewpoint, but potentially one can think that the recognition of cultural diversity among Black Americans, including now in this category recent African immigrants, might serve to dissociate long-standing assumptions about culture and history from skin color. Indeed, the religious leaders I spoke to, many of them expressed some awareness of the role that Africans might play in this regard. Ironically, though, it was an Ethiopian pastor who had earlier emphasized how little the Ethiopians identified with other Africans, who was most articulate about what Ethiopians might have to offer to American civic culture in this regard. He remembered that if you trace back when the black movement was started, and these are his words, it was called Ethiopianization. They meant the fact that Ethiopia remained free from any nation, from any aggression. It became a model and motivation for the black community, both in Africa, America, and Europe. Ethiopia, he said, with a great deal of pride, is the only country of Africa that has never been colonized. In Africa, it's the only nation that has been independent through and through. So that virginity is already there. That virginity of identity is there, which is a treasure for every Ethiopian. However, that same sense of cultural identity that gives Ethiopians so much to contribute to American civic culture is also what seems to keep them from taking an active civic role, even on the part of other African Americans. Because of that virginity of identity, he said, wherever the Ethiopians go, we don't see them mixing. Do we support any black movement here? No, we don't as a church. Even in our own country, we don't tend to support political movements. We don't want to define the church by politics. Of the African immigrant groups in LA, the Ethiopians are probably the most successful, better poised in terms of economic, social, and cultural resources to have an impact on civic life. However, the strong sense of ethnic identity means that any altruistic efforts that are engaged by these Ethiopian churches are directed back to Ethiopia rather than to the needs of their immediate neighbors. This pastor down in LA that I spoke to described numerous ongoing efforts to send assistance to Ethiopians, both in the country and in refugee situations outside of Ethiopia. But when I asked if this church was doing anything for the immediate neighborhood, the church is located on Pico Boulevard in an economically depressed area, he replied using the universal language of political doublespeak. We have assigned some people to make a feasibility study. Which of course means that it's been sent to committee to die a lingering death. The African Ministries Association, of which none of the Ethiopian pastors I spoke to are involved, strikes me as having the most potential for mobilizing Africans in Southern California into civic life. If civic concerns are currently on the back burner in the minds of many of its current members, civic issues are simmering there, and if I can belabor the metaphor a little bit more, the association's current president is turning up the heat. He told me that although the association was formed in order to bring the African ministers together for prayer, fellowship, and mutual support, The association is now reaching out to other African American ministers because they have the same goal, goals which he described in distinctly civic terms. Our goal is to help the people here in America. Our goal is to feed the poor, those in the hospital to visit them, and the homeless to shelter. Then the youth and the teenagers. Our goal is to reach them and encourage them to do well. However, as of right now, the African Ministries Association is still getting these initiatives going, largely because of internal jealousy and competition between its current members. One member said, if right now I initiated something and I go and call on the other ministers, hey, this is what it is, come along, he'll think it's my project, he won't be encouraged to come, and he may even try to keep me from reaching the goal. So, several factors have combined to prevent African immigrant communities from taking an active role at the present. A lack of identity between the Africans and African Americans, which might serve to connect the African immigrant communities to the kinds of civic resources and know-how that is characteristic of African American religion, and internal strife. Furthermore, among the Ethiopians, a strong sense of ethnic identity has meant that even where there are the resources, there isn't the desire to do anything. In short, where the resources are, there isn't interest. Where the interest is, there aren't the resources. Thank you.
Well, I'd like to thank all our panelists. According to our official schedule, we were supposed to go to lunch at 11:45, but if it's okay with everyone, I was hoping we could have 15 minutes or so for questions and postpone. Those who are really hungry can just scoot out the door right now, and then the people with questions can stay. But I believe we have wandering microphones, so if you raise your hand, I'll try to acknowledge people one at a time, and then you have to wait for the microphone before you begin speaking so that it's recorded for television.
1, 2, and 3, please.
Samuel Paul, USC Center for Religion and Civic Culture. I have a question, or a two-part question for the Sikh presenters. Firstly, I'm a little intrigued as to why the large concentration of Sikh folk are in Fresno, but that's a side issue. I was wanting to know, how does the public face of Sikhism in America compare or differ with the public face of Sikhism in England? And how did September 11th change American Sikh nationalism, if it did?
As for the first question, you want to take that one? Go ahead. I've been trumped.
Well, with England, I'm no expert, but religion in between England and America, I think, is very different. I think it's treated in two very different ways, from my perspective, because of constitutional reasons, simply. But in terms of the Sikh community, I think there's a much higher density and a much more established community in England. A lot of Punjabi pop culture comes out of England right now. They are more into the mainstream in England. From what it was interesting to me as how they treated September 11th and how it affected them. From what I've heard, it didn't affect them as much as it affected Sikhs in America. Just because they've been there for so long and they're so part of the mainstream culture, much more so than Sikhs in America. And I would attribute that to their longevity there and to their density in the population.
And then I think the second question was, how did September 11th change the Yeah, that was something that I was going to go over in the second part. Obviously, they do feel the need to educate the American public about the Sikh faith. And what happened after September 11th, most of the Sikhs I talked to in Los Angeles experienced verbal harassment and some physical harassment. There was a number of cases of that. And so I think, like I was showing Hitman 2, and I was talking about dysfunctional family, they've attempted to put themselves out in the community more. For example, this is kind of an interesting way. They set up a table at the LA Marathon this year near the end to give out food and drink to the runners. And I asked, this was from Ratan Singh, who is the head of the Vermont Gurdwara, and he said, we just wanted to get people out there so they see us participating in everyday life. And so this idea, I think someone asked earlier about faith in action, and Sikhism does go beyond its Sikh boundaries for faith in action. Whether it's simple things like this, or participating in interfaith dialogues, or whether it's memorialization for Balbir Singh Sodhi, who was killed right after. So September 11th mobilized them to realize people don't know much about Sikhs at all. They see the turban, now they identify that as Taliban or something else. So we need to be more proactive, and they have been more proactive. Does that answer it? Yeah.
And in short, I like Dan's statement about mobilization, because I think these sentiments that we brought up earlier about Sikhs and American and how the Sikh community perceives itself to be consistent with American values has existed for a long time. But as Dan said, they were inspired to mobilize and vocalize that sentiment post September 11th.
Marjorie Green, Anti-Defamation League. A question to David regarding the African immigrants. How long will there be a distinct sense of African immigrants versus the African American population? I would assume that some of our identity is cast by how we are perceived. And in thinking about both how the children of the African Americans will be perceived of as being African American, although they have not had that same cultural identity, and the seductiveness of the African American pop culture that is so pervasive, that indeed the distinctiveness of the culture may not last. I have one other question, and that's a look at the Ethiopian experience. Here I'm looking at the Jewish immigrants who have moved to Israel. And I think of Gus Niebuhr's comments yesterday about the dynamic that is involved, melting pot versus what the host society receives in terms of a particular culture, and hearing a Israeli psychologist refer to the hope that the gentleness of the Israeli immigrant population in Israel would have some impact on the larger Israeli society. Indeed, what I have seen as I've come to know the Ethiopian Israelis is that they have become Israelized very quickly, much as, American immigrants have been. So, 2 questions. Thank you.
As to the first question, how long will a distinct African identity persist given the pervasiveness of African American influences in American culture? That's impossible to say. Obviously, to many African parents, there's a great deal of desire to sustain a distinct African identity in their children. And as I mentioned, some even go so far as to take their children on vacations, extended vacations, months-long vacations in their home countries in Africa, and sometimes even send their young adults, their teenagers, there to live for a couple of years if they can afford to do so. For this very reason, there's a great concern about maintaining that African identity, and in particular, the way this was often spoken of was maintaining African values. I'm not entirely sure what that means, except that I know one of the concerns that has been raised by several of the pastors is respect for and concern for one's elders. One pastor I spoke to even said that part of what helps Africans to maintain a sense of identity with their African origins is the fact that many of them still have parents, grandparents living there. And he said any African living in America who still has family living in Africa feels a sense of responsibility to them. The children feel a sense of responsibility to their parents, and that helps to maintain that sense of identity. But that may disappear within a couple of generations as the young African immigrant people are born and raised here in the United States. So it's impossible to say how long that African identity will persist. Clearly, the young Africans are listening to rap, hip-hop, and all of that, and in some ways assimilating African-American culture. As for the Ethiopians, there's an interesting thing going on. There's a very, very strong sense, even stronger among the Ethiopians than among other Africans, sense of connection to their homeland. And I was told, as you know, just within, I think, the last 10 years or so, a part of Los Angeles has been, there at Fairfax and Pico, has been designated as the Little Ethiopia. But apparently, this has been a relatively recent thing. Many Ethiopians immigrated to the United States, immigrated to Southern California, fully expecting that conditions back at home would make it possible for them to return to Ethiopia, and were very hesitant to invest in life here in Southern California. That level of investment in businesses, homes, and in civic life is a very, very recent development.
Hi, I'm Steve Prothero. I'm visiting with the CAP Center. I have a question for Hajer and maybe also for Vincent. I enjoyed both of your papers. I know in American Buddhist studies there's a real sharp distinction that's typically drawn between convert Buddhists and immigrant Buddhists, or immigrants and their children. And I was struck, particularly in Hajer's paper, about a lack of attention to African Americans, who constitute a huge minority, by many accounts 40–45% of the Muslim population in the United States. And that lack of attention was particularly striking given the title, that this is about civil rights. And the language of civil rights, of course, comes in the U.S. Through African Americans. And what I'm wondering is whether African American Muslims are largely unconcerned about things like the Patriot Act, whether W.D. Muhammad, who is now a real aggressive Americanizer of Islam, as far as I understand, with flags in the mosques and that sort of thing, looking something like the Nichiren Shoshu Association used to look on the Buddhist side in terms of aggressive Americanization. Whether there's a real sharp divide over these issues of activism that you've uncovered in your paper, in part because these African American Muslims are reacting against their black Muslim Nation of Islam past and saying, we're not going to get into that, criticizing, the American administration, the man, we're not going to do that because now we're on to religion. So I wonder if you could, either of you, address that issue. Is there a lack of interest in these questions, or are you just looking in the wrong places, or what?
It's not really a lack of interest, but in my paper I concentrated on immigrant communities from the Middle East and Asia. So it's not about indigenous American Muslims here, and I tried to study the evolution of Muslim public activism in relation to the Middle East, and these immigrants who come from the Middle East are mostly affected by these developments, and indigenous American Muslims are less influenced by these changes in the Middle East. And I think that what is happening now in the world scene reflects the fact that these Middle Eastern immigrants are are mostly affected by what is taking place. For the ministry of W.D. Muhammad, we know that the ministry from 1975, there were attempts on the part of Imam W.D. Muhammad to drive black Muslims into mainstream Islam, and they were coalitions built with the between mainstream Muslims and the ministry of W.D. Muhammad. I refer to the fact that when they formed the American Muslims for Jerusalem coalition, W.D. Muhammad was involved in that coalition too. There were also speakers from the ministry of W.D. Muhammad who were invited in ISNA and in different conferences held by Muslim public activist organizations. There is cooperation between black Muslims and immigrant American Muslims in the U.S. The trouble is with the Nation of Islam. And when I went to the Islamic Center of Southern California and interviewed Dr. Hathout, he told me these are not Muslims because they do have another Quran and they do believe in another prophet. And it's something different than the Islam that immigrant Muslims and the ministry of W.D. Muhammad are worshipping. I hope that I answered your question.
And I would just like to point out that there are Islams in Southern California. The Islam as a religion places a great emphasis on unity, but there are also there's a diverse set of orientations within the tradition. And since I focused in my paper upon public space, the segment of the Muslim community that was were setting up these large memorializations of September 11th tended to be those of newer immigrants, post-1965 immigrants, rather than the African American Muslim community.
I think it's time for us to take a break.